Hello.
Hello, please.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And in this video, we're going to take a look at a potential link between the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe and a £500,000 consignment of cannabis which was dropped in a pond in West Hanningfield, some 4 weeks and only 6 miles apart. Firstly, we're going to hear from a newspaper article which discusses Kevin Whitaker. He was a courier for Tucker, Tate and Rolfe who met his demise by the hands of Rolfe and Tucker. Let's now take a look at that newspaper article. The following newspaper article is from June 2000, and the title of this article is simply "The End of the Road." Now, I won't read this article out in its entirety as it does cover a lot of information which we are already aware of, so I'll just focus to start with on the connection between Kevin Whitaker and the Essex Boys. Rolfe had introduced Whitaker to Tucker, and they were starting to use him as a middleman and courier for drugs. Whitaker had been involved in a £60,000 cannabis deal with a firm from Romford. It had gone wrong, and Tucker had lost out. As Whitaker was the go-between, the debt was down to him, and Tucker wanted to know how he was going to pay. Whitaker blamed the firm from Romford for the loss of the cannabis, so Tucker and Rolfe said that they would take him to the firm to confront the people. They were getting increasingly annoyed. It started to dawn on them that they wouldn't be seeing their money anytime soon. They had hold of Whitaker, and they kept saying to him, "Thieve our gear, would you? You cheeky cunt." Something like that anyway. They were forcing him to take cocaine and Special K. He was out of his head on the gear that they had forced him to take. They left Basildon and were travelling along the A127 towards Romford. Tucker said as they reached the Rettendon to Dunton turnoff that Whitaker was slipping in and out of consciousness. They got out and pulled Whitaker out of the vehicle, but he just collapsed on the side of the road. They drove off and looked back. Whitaker was motionless. Rolfe got out of the car and ran back to him. He stood over him and kept telling him to get up, but still there was no response. "Fucking leave him," said Tucker. "You can't leave him here," replied Rolfe. It was about 6 o'clock and everyone was coming out of work. They drove the car back the short distance to where Whitaker lay. Tucker and Rolfe got out of the car and they both put Whitaker back inside. They then drove back over the A127 to Dunton Road. Tucker said they looked at Whitaker and they knew he was dead. They pulled him out of the car and he was put in the ditch. When Tucker was asked what he was going to do, he was laughing, but everyone knew he was concerned. He said the old Bill would just think that Whitaker had taken a bit too much gear at someone's house and died. That person not wanting a body in their home would have taken him out and dumped him anyway. Tucker was right. Detectives could find no evidence to support any murder claims. Whitaker was written off as a junkie who had overdosed. At the time of the inquest, Tate was still laid up in Basildon Hospital after being shot. Each evening, members of the firm gathered around Tate's bedside, listening to blaring house music, taking drugs, and generally having a party. Nobody dared object, until a nurse discovered a gun while making up Tate's bed. She contacted the police and Tate was arrested. Because he was still out on licence for his 6-year robbery sentence, he was automatically returned to prison for being in possession of a firearm, something which broke his parole conditions. Tucker, too, was feeling vulnerable. When Tucker turned up at the clubs on a Friday evening, he would often be seen in his black Porsche, and when you would open the door to get in, he would always have a handgun on the seat between his legs. Pat Tate was due to be released from prison soon after his breach of parole, and everybody was talking about an article which had been in the local papers. £500,000 worth of cannabis had been found in a farmer's pond near a place called Rettendon. It was believed that £336 of cannabis wrapped in 53 different plastic parcels around the size of videotapes, had been dropped from a low-flying aircraft. Instead of landing in the field, it had landed in a pond, and the dealers were unable to find it. Tucker said he was going to find out who the drugs belonged to. He didn't like the idea of people trading on his manor, particularly if he wasn't going to get a slice of the profit. He also knew that the drugs had been lost and there would be a replacement shipment coming in soon. Word soon reached Tucker that the Rettendon drugs had been destined for a heavy firm from Canning Town in East London. He approached the people concerned and told them he was interested in purchasing any future shipments. They told him they were due to receive a replacement drop and they would keep him informed so a deal could be struck when it arrived. Tucker had a better idea. He was going to steal it. Tate's other get-rich-quick scheme was also underway at this time. He had approached shady car dealers, villains and dodgy businessmen to put up approximately £120,000 in cash for a shipment of cannabis from Amsterdam. Okay, so this really does give us a different take on the original story or the original version of events that we've been told. And I guess really this is one of only a few stories or a few versions which actually makes any sense, which doesn't include Michael Steele or Jack Womes having any kind of involvement. I've always believed that this cannabis drop that went wrong at West Hanningfield had some sort of connection to the murders themselves. I made a video a little while ago and I showed you just how far West Hanningfield was from Rettendon, the scene of the murders, and you should be able to see in front of you there that it's just over 6 miles away. Now what I want you to do is ask yourself, how coincidental would it be for there to be £500,000 worth of cannabis mistakenly dropped in a farmer's pond? I think this happened in November 95. I think it was literally about 4 weeks before the murders. What would the possibility be of such a large-scale drug operation gone wrong, as it were, with this cannabis being dropped in a pond, and the murder of 3 drug dealers just 6 miles away down the road, some 4 weeks later? Now, is there some sort of connection there? Is Michael Steele somehow involved as being potentially the pilot of the drugs which were being flown in? That's another question you need to ask yourself. If these drugs were flown in, how many people were actually flying, small aircraft in Essex during that time, dropping off shipments of drugs? My guess would be not very many at all. Now, one of the first things which came to my mind when reading the original article regarding the finding of the large shipment of cannabis in a farmer's pond in West Hanningfield was that this news was going to get back to drug dealers who weren't actually involved in that importation. Especially if Tony Tucker, someone who had the monopoly of the doors at clubs, etc., during this time, and also combine that with the way that these 3 were behaving, as in Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, during this period. They were paranoid, they were hyped up, they were aggressive, they were really sort of loose cannons to some degree. Now imagine being in Tucker's position if he wasn't involved in this importation and all of a sudden £500,000 worth of cannabis is dropped in the wrong place. The first thing that he's going to be thinking is, who's muscling in on my stuff, who's selling gear on my patch. And that was one of the first things that crossed my mind, that this would have got back to those people if they weren't involved in that original importation. So the fact that this story is telling us that Tucker got wind of that, he then thought to himself, I'm not having these people muscling in on my patch and, taking over my doors potentially, selling drugs in my clubs and all that sort of stuff. You can kind of see the cogs turning in Tucker's brain if you look at it from that perspective. So I can see this being really credible, that Tucker found out this information, he read about it in the local newspaper, and he started to get agitated. He started to get concerned about who was muscling in on his patch, who was selling drugs. Where did this £500,000 worth of shipment come from? Who had been involved in it? Who was responsible for it? When he found out who was responsible, he actually called a meeting, then decided, actually, I'm going to rip these people off, like they had done to many other dealers, many other big-time dealers and people from the underworld. They'd been stitching up people left, right and centre. This was just the next person in the line of people that had stitched up that previous year. And finally, let's take a look at a newspaper article from 1998, where this drug drop in West Hanningfield is discussed again. But this time we hear from Detective Inspector Ivan Dibley, where he believes that there is a connection between that drug drop in West Hanningfield and the triple murder of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Let's now hear from that following news article. Detectives who investigated the triple murder in Rettendon believe there could be a link between the case and £500,000 worth of cannabis found in a farmer's pond in West Hanningfield. The cannabis, discovered in 53 black plastic packets and weighing more than 300 weight, had been dropped from an aircraft. It was found by farmer Jens Halstrup and recovered by Essex Police Underwater Search Unit around 22 months ago. The link was revealed exclusively to the Essex Chronicle on Wednesday by ex-Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who led the major part of the investigations until his retirement from the Essex Police Force after 32 years. While detectives were hunting the cold-blooded killers, they took a serious look at the possible connection. Ex-Superintendent Ivan Dibley stated, quote, "I strongly believe there was a connection between the cannabis in West Hanningfield and this case." Right, okay, so I'm going to stop there because then it goes on to talk about, well, Michael Steele and Jack Womes were involved because of a poor shipment of cannabis. But really, this is one of the only versions of events that I can recall hearing about that doesn't involve Steele and Womes, which actually appears quite credible. So I don't see how, Detective Ivan Dibley can go on to state that there was some sort of connection between this drug drop and the triple murder, and then go on to link in Steele and Womes into that, because if they didn't have any dealings with this, importation in West Hanningfield, then I don't see how he can put the pieces of the puzzle together and actually, connect Steele and Womes to the triple murders. If the drug drop in West Hanningfield was down to a different firm in potentially Canning Town or somewhere like that, then surely they were the people who had the motive, and they were the people that were setting up the potential deal with Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. I fail to see how Steele and Womes become somehow entangled in this whole situation. So to summarise this video, I guess the best way to do that is to look at it from Tony Tucker's perspective. If it is true that he had no sort of dealings in that importation regarding the drop in the pond in West Hanningfield, the £500,000 drug drop, which obviously would have been worth a damn sight more back in 1995 than it is now, if he had no dealing in that, would this have actually triggered Tucker and made him kind of paranoid and potentially look to sort of stitch up those who were responsible for that drug drop? We know of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe's increasing drug use during this time, and most importantly, an increase in their erratic behaviour. They didn't really care who they stitched up. They didn't really care whose toes were trodden on. I guess I also find it incredibly coincidental that just 6 miles up the road from the scene of the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, and only 4 weeks before that event, £500,000 worth of drugs was misdropped into a farmer's pond. Now, if you look at all the pieces of this puzzle and you try and put them together very briefly, they do actually fit perfectly. Can you imagine the situation? Can you imagine exactly how Tucker, Tate and Rolfe end up down a lane just 6 miles away down the road? Could it have been if there was a deal which was going to be taking place, or Tucker was going to be part of some sort of negotiations? You can imagine Workhouse Lane being the perfect meeting point. It's just near 6 miles away from where those drugs were dropped in West Hanningfield, and a perfect meeting place is literally 6 miles down the road at Workhouse Lane. The fact that these two locations are so close in proximity tells me that there's a large possibility here that those two events are connected. Could it have been that Tucker, who was seemingly acting paranoid and overly aggressive during this period in time, decided that he was going to stitch up this other firm? He wasn't going to have other people muscling in on his door business. He didn't want other people shipping out £500,000 worth of drugs on his patch. He then decided, along with Tate and Rolfe, that they were going to stitch these people up. But little did they know that they were already going to be executed. Whoever did this potentially wanted to take over the doors themselves. They wanted control of the drugs in the Essex area. And what better way to do that than to give the allure that they were sort of shipping in large quantities of drugs to lure Tucker out. By doing that, they could then sort of form some sort of faux partnership and double-crossed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe down the lane on the evening of December the 6th. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You should be able to see in front of you shortly some other videos from the channel, and also the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the Essex Boys videos from my channel in one folder. So do feel free to check those out. As always, many thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.